With me are my colleagues, Cecilia Barra-Diego, who's heading our legal research team, and Raquel Althoff, who's our head of the consulting team, and we'll take you through the requirements of the new EU directive, or draft directive, and what it means for companies today, just to give you a few insights from our assessment of the directive and what we hear from clients and how we're working with clients. Before we jump into the topic and the discussion, let me shortly explain how the session will be structured and will be speaking. I've introduced my two colleagues. I'll say a few words more a bit later. We're focusing on the draft EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and we will start with the political timeline. So how long will it take until it's in place? We'll examine the key obligations. Cecilia is going to take us through that. And we'll share the learning approach and what we would recommend how to handle that on a practical base, which is what Raquel is going to take us through. There will be some examples, obviously, from the work that we have done in the past, so that you see how different companies take different decisions on this. Let me share some of the practicalities before we start. So chat will be around 20 minutes, giving some input from our side, and then another 20 minutes will be devoted to your questions. So please note your questions whenever they come up, and then you can use the Q&A box at the bottom. And there's a possibility to upvote the question, which is helpful for us, so we know which questions are of the biggest importance. You can also ask questions live. Just raise your hand and we'll unmute you. My colleague Sarah Kramer, who's in the background, who's the director of all of this, and she was going to take care of that. And that we will also have a short poll in the middle. And it would be great if you could share your responses to this poll. Any questions we cannot answer immediately, we'll get back to you later. Obviously, we'll send an email with answers or documents that you may request. So let me start with setting the political scene. We all know the background of this directive is the EU Green Deal and the EU's responsibility for international trade and the political will to shape trade in a more fair way and to make sure that not one part of the economy takes advantage of other economies or countries, to generally make globalization more fair. That's basically the political background of this. It has become so much more on the top of the agenda with the current situation. We're seeing the situation in Ukraine, the situation with Russia, but also in the background looming the whole China debate that we're seeing. So all of the topics that are addressed in this EU Sustainability Due Diligence Directive have become a lot more important for companies and for politics in general. The political timeline is that this is a draft. Lawmaking at the European level works in the way that the Commission is presenting a draft, and then it needs to find compromise with the European Parliament and the European governments represented in the European Council. This may take a while, especially in a hotly debated draft directive like the one we're talking about today. So we can assume that finding compromise on this draft directive will take between 1 and 2 years, depending. Some took longer in the past, some were faster in the past, but 2 years is quite a good idea. And once that is adopted by the Council and Parliament, it needs to be translated into national law, which is going to take another 2 years. So realistically, we're speaking about a time perspective of 3 to 5 years before this draft law is going to be enacted, actually. Nevertheless, what we see that is even if it is far away, that we see that a lot of people in the market, a lot of companies in the market are looking at the directive, at the core requirements, and are asking themselves, how can we set up due diligence now in a way that we are in compliance with national law and at the same time will also be in compliance with European law in the future? So how do we build these systems? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we'll start with the assessment of the core and the obligations in the proposed EU directive. And I'll ask Cecilia, as our head of legal research. Cecilia, where do you see the key obligations of this proposed EU directive?
Thanks, Marcus, for that. And again, as you mentioned, this is a draft, and of course, this is subject to change. But this, in any case, provided with an idea of the direction the EU is taking in this regard. So let me tell you in a nutshell the key obligation of the draft directive that you can also see in the slides. So companies need to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence. And what does the directive mean by that? It means first, integrating due diligence into companies' policies. This means developing and adopting a due diligence policy and making sure that this is integrated into all companies' corporate policies. The due diligence policy should include a description of the company's approach to due diligence, a code of conduct, a description of the processes in place to implement due diligence. And the second step is to identify action and potential adverse impacts. That adverse impacts are identified in the annexes of the directive. And as I see that some of our audience are representative of German companies, let me point out here that this differs a bit from the German Act in the sense that the directive goes beyond the list of human rights and environmental risks listed under the Act. I'm happy to elaborate further on this in the Q&A session. The next step is the adoption of measures to prevent and mitigate potential adverse impacts and bring actual adverse impacts to an end. Fourth is establishing and maintaining a complaint procedure. Fifth is monitoring the effectiveness of the policies and measures. This means conducting periodic assessment of the risk identifications and the measures taken in this regard. And finally, publicly reporting. So these steps are not new. The directive is mirroring, in this sense, international standards. So if you're in a company that has been following the OECD or the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, you should be already in a good shape to fulfill the requirements. And what is the scope? So meaning, in which areas does the company have to conduct the due diligence? Well, own operations, their subsidiaries, and the value chain operations carried out by entities with whom the company has an established business relationship. You can read that this is a wording from the directive, and I will come back to the concept on established business relationship because we discuss later other points together with my colleague Raquel. But the interesting point here that I want to make is that the entire value chain is covered. So that means that downstream business relationships fall within the scope of the directive. And here again, this is a bit different. This is different from the German Act because the German Act covers own business operations and suppliers' activities, meaning only upstream business relationships. So this is broader that we see. So this is an interesting point to take into account. And we see also that the directive requires large companies to adopt a plan to combat climate change. Specifically, companies are required to assess the extent to which climate change is a risk for or an impact of the company's operations. So, and they need to adopt a plan in line with the Paris Agreement on climate change. And this is also new. This is a standalone article, meaning that it's not part of the core requirements in the context of due diligence, but it's there. And it's an important aspect in this regard. And moving on to the final point that I want to make here on the key obligations is that the directive also introduces duties for the directors of the EU companies that it covers. And these include setting up and overseeing the implementation of the due diligence processes and integrating due diligence into the corporate strategy. And in addition, when directors act in the interest of the company, they must take into account the consequences of their decisions on sustainability matters. And that includes human rights, climate, and environment. And of course, they also need to take into account the consequences of any decision in the long term. And again, on this point, the duty of care is not new, but the directive makes sure that sustainability matters are included as part of the director's duty of care across EU member states. So I think this is an interesting point. And this is in a nutshell the due diligence obligations. I leave it here for now. I'm happy to elaborate further on the Q&A questions, sessions that you, on questions that you may have in this regard. And I hand over to Marcus here at this point. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Cecilia. Just to
Hello?
I think that Marcus had issues with the internet, probably. Yeah, maybe Cecilia, we can go on.
Yes, sure.
Right?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, so maybe what I would like to complement now based on what Cecilia said, and then try to answer a question of, okay, under the circumstances, right, that we have the draft, how can companies
to really understand the points?
Sorry, Marcus?
Marcus, you're back now.
But Marcus, you're not, you're off for some time.
Okay.
So once
sorry,
Cecilia
everybody.
stopped talking, then we couldn't listen to you. So I just hand it over back to you.
Yeah, so I hand over to Marcus again.
Yeah.
Well, sorry for this. So my question really to Cecilia was, if I understood you well, Cecilia, is that there are differences between the draft EU law and the German law, but there are also commonalities because they are both based on the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which also means on the OECD guidance. I got that right?
Yeah, I think in general, process-wise, we could say that. Of course, there are some differences as we see in terms of the scope of the due diligence obligations, I already explained, and also the human rights and environmental risks that are covered, that the directive goes a bit beyond of what the German Act foresees. But in general, we can say that process-wise, of course, is definitely related because the directive is mirroring international standards as the German Act does.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So let me direct your question at Raquel. So on the basis of this, Raquel, so you're the head of our consulting team. So how do you and our consulting teams, how do they work with clients? So what do we advise them to do? Ignore the EU directive because it's just a draft, look at it, incorporate it. How do you work with that? And what do you say, what are you telling clients?
Yes, thanks, Marcus, for this question. So we don't say ignore it. Of course, there's a draft and we have to start looking into it, right? But the core advice we give is that, as Cecilia mentioned, all these laws, they are based on the UNGPs, and you stress that as well, right? I mean, in terms of process, what you have to do, I mean, what's the management process that you need behind it? So it's really based on the UNGPs, the OECD. Meaning that those companies that already started their journey on human rights due diligence based on the UNGPs, they shall continue using the UNGPs as a basis, and of course look into the details of the law, right? Cecilia mentioned some specifics, but I can also add another point. So the directive is talking specifically about how to address SMEs in the supply chain, giving some specific directions on that. So the UNGPs doesn't really touch on this, but in terms of the core of conducting human rights due diligence, establishing a human rights risk management process, and this all comes from the UNGPs. So what we're working with our clients is that every time you want to understand whether you're in line with laws, and if we're talking to German companies, then of course the Lieferketten Gesetz, and then of course European companies, we're talking about the directive. Of course you need to look into that, but don't forget to go beyond, and don't forget that you need a very robust human rights due diligence system. You need a risk management system behind it, very strong, looking downstream, looking upstream, and really in a way that you have a risk-based approach.
So could you elaborate on the concept of a robust human rights due diligence process? Because we all heard human rights due diligence processes, of course, and management systems. But what do you mean when you call it a robust system?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So a robust system starts with a very good risk assessment, right? So companies shouldn't really get, and then Ms. Cecilia can elaborate on that, get into these little details of what the laws both laws, right, are saying about what's the scope. I mean, what kind of companies in their supply chain they should consider. So robust human resource diligence is really starting with a very good risk assessment, a very good prioritization of risk, so that companies can really select where they're going to put their efforts in terms of putting measures in place, so that they can also, once they decide where they put their efforts, they also put the efforts on measuring the effectiveness of these measures, right? So, and this is a robust human rights due diligence. You really start understanding your risks. You need to really go, as I said, look everywhere, downstream, upstream, on operations. Where is the risk? And this is really what is going to guide you through all the journey of human rights due diligence. And maybe Cecilia, I think you could give us some examples, right, on how some specifics of the law might take people to an understanding that is not really in line.
Yeah, that's a good point. And let me, so I come back to the concept of established business relationship. And I think this is an interesting example because this concept narrows down the scope of the due diligence obligations to direct and indirect business relationships that are lasting in view of intensity or duration. So this is a novel concept and has created confusion, and because it doesn't put the focus, as you were saying, of the due diligence where the most severe risks, going through and impacts that occur along the value chains, and taking into account the severity irrespective of where they are in the value chain, but rather whether or not a business relationship can be described as established according to the directive. So this, of course, has created a lot of criticism and debate, because it departs a bit from the international standards, where you look at the whole, you have a comprehensive view in terms of the risk, and you go, you take into account the entire value chain, and you don't put the details of whether a business relationship can be considered as established or not. So we will need to wait for more clarification on this point, and again we will see whether this stays in the final text. But this is an example of the topics that we see that might distract companies at this stage to actually conduct a robust human rights due diligence and take into account all the elements that you were mentioning before, Raquel, on this point. So I think that illustrates the type of limitations. I don't know, Marcus, if you would like to add something that we see also at the national level in Germany on this.
I'm encountering these irritations and confusions as well with a lot of companies, and it's always around, basically it's about around three issues. One is the question of the threshold. Are we in the scope or not, which leads to confusion. Secondly, it's a question of substantiated knowledge, which is a concept in the German law. Mm-hmm. And now with this new concept of established business relationship, that's something from the draft EU law. So we'll see whether it stays in the draft or not. And basically, what I believe is that all of these concepts are actually misleading companies, because they are creating an illusion of limitation of the scope. Let's say, well, we don't have to do a risk analysis because we only have 2,995 employees. That's why we're not in the scope, and that's why we don't need to look at our risks. That's one illusion. Or the other illusion is then, well, if we do not look at our risks beyond tier 1, because that's the demand of the German law, and we don't have substantiated knowledge, we avoid looking into newspapers and things like that. There's the illusion that, well, if we don't know, we don't have to do anything. And I think this is a grave mistake if companies do take this approach. This is a very defensive approach, which sometimes lawyers tend to take for their reasoning, but from a business perspective, from a strategy, risk management perspective, this is absolutely not a good idea. So we strongly advise our clients to be aware of the risks that you have, because if you don't know your risks, you cannot manage them. So ignore whether you have substantiated knowledge or not, because you don't know how a judge or a journalist will, what they will say about your substantiated knowledge. Look at your risk, be aware of your risk. It's really important that you are able to manage risks that are there and not be confused by these funny, not well-defined legalistic legal concept, because also you never know how a judge is going to understand this concept. So we strongly advise, be on the safe side and really look at your list, at your risks. So that was a short introduction by us, just a few points that we wanted to make. Common denominators between the EU law and the German law, a few differences, and our basic approach to that. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions around that. So please feel free to your questions. And let me try to find the question Q&A box. I see no questions yet, so please feel free to put in some questions there. Or am I looking at the wrong box? Oh, there they are. They are in the chat. So there's also a Q&A box. We'll start with the chat.
There's a question in the chat, Marcus. So the question is, what is the difference between German law and the EU Directive in terms of liability of the management board?
I would suggest that Cecilia has a go at that, and then maybe I can add.
Yeah, what I could say is that the directive, I think the directive has a double enforcement mechanism. So the authority, the administrative enforcement through the authority, and that's similar to the German Act. And then there's the civil liability provision. So companies can be held liable for damage. And again, we need to see how this evolves in terms of, I think I would leave it like that in terms of detail. How there's a duty of directors that I already explained, but in terms of how these will combine with the liability, the civil liability, I think this is something that needs to be seen. Then I couldn't go into. I don't know, Marcus, if you want any additional comment on that.
I think it's a very good and important point Cecilia was making from a legal point of view. But I think companies should be aware that the German Lieferkettengesetz as such did not add anything. But there are a lot of other legal liabilities that company directors have, and very often in the debate, people tend to forget that. Say, well, there's no liability in the Lieferkettengesetz except for that you have to hand in a report. But there are a lot of other liabilities in other laws that can hit company directors. So people should be aware, or management should be aware of the whole picture, not just look at at one of the laws. And the same will be true for the European Draft Directive. Whether liability is in there or not, at the end of the day, we're going to see, because that's hotly debated. Business associations don't want it, and so on. So we don't know at this stage. And I believe it's also not so important at this stage. I would focus on building the due diligence, or as Raquel was called it, a robust due diligence, because that at the end of the day is the best way of protecting yourself as a director or also as a company against any claims or any things that might happen. Reduce the probability of things happening. That's the best way to move forward. And then you can still think of liability once it's really in the law. So there's one question here which says, how can SME with less than 250 employees be affected by the German or EU human rights legislation? What do you recommend them in terms of their supply chain? Raquel, would you want to?
Yeah, of course. So in the end, I think the message Marcus tried to convey before is that even though companies don't fall under the scope of these laws, they are part of supply chains. meaning that their customers or clients are going to require them somehow to comply. They're going to require them to also pass down these requirements to their supply chain, right? So this is what's going to happen in practice, and that's why even small companies, they need to look into the topic. Of course, all this. If you look into the UNGPs, everything has to be in line with the capability of the company to handle it, right? So small companies, they probably will have very low leverage in their supply chain. So of course, it's quite limited on what they can do in practice, but there are things they can do. They can convey messages, having codes of conduct. They might have closer relationships with the suppliers. They can have engagements that are more directly, right? And then of course, they could also have internal processes in their own operations that big companies, they tend to be, of course, policies and procedures that are more structured. Smaller companies, it's going to be in a different way, but still they need to assess the risk, understand where they need to act, and find ways to handle it, what is possible, of course, given its size.
I believe it's also important to say in that context as that looking at the market and at consultancies and things that are being developed is that we see a technology and knowledge movement forward, which will make things available to smaller companies more and more year after year, because knowledge is developed, tools are developed, and so on. I think that's also an important point in that context to make. So there are some more questions here. One is a comparison between the French Loi de Vigilance and the EU Directive. Any ideas about that, Cecilia?
No, in terms of process-wise, or yeah, I wouldn't.
In terms of similarities and difference between the two.
We are focusing a lot in practice on the German Act. So this is what we really put a focus on. And I think in terms of the French Act, there's no, one of the differences is that human rights are not defined in the way that, for instance, in the German Act, you can see that in the annex and in the EU Directive. So this is one of the differences, but in terms of the details of the processes, I wouldn't get there to go into the details at this point. But yeah, in practice, we are of course more familiar with the German Act in terms of the differences of the scope.
I mean, what's maybe important to say in that context is that all national laws, whether it's the French law or the Dutch law, the Dutch anti-child labor law, or the German law or other laws, will be consumed by once the EU directive is transformed into national law. I don't see that any member states would leave their national legislation in place, creating tensions between national law or differences between national laws and the European law, especially as it is so important for companies to have one set of rules that will apply across the single market, and for, you know, especially companies that are working in several European countries need a set of rules that will apply to all of them, one set of rules and not a set of different rules. It's one of the motivations to introduce this European law.
And again, also an important message here is that this will be considered the minimum, right? Of course, member states can go beyond that, but what we will see in the directive is considered to be the minimum that needs to be there in all national legislations. Yeah, so that's an important message.
Question by, oh, sorry, Cecilia.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. That's what I wanted to say. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question by Patricia Caraco, which says, I would like to ask, what would be your best advice for a company that needs to start from scratch to define and deploy a human rights risk framework in the supply chain? Any tools, even available guides that you recommend to look at? I'm sure Raquel has a great answer to that one.
Yeah, so yeah, of course there are tools out there, right? I mean, people have been developing risk assessments for some time now. I mean, this is something we do a lot for our clients. So we have our own tools, we have our own methodology. Of course, out there you also have some others. I would say that in terms of the difference, you have methodologies that are more tailored to the client, really looking to the sourcing categories specifically that you have, the company has. Some other methodologies, they're going to look into a group of commodities. So depending on the companies, these are helpful. I mean, these are standard assessments out there, but of course, depending on how your supply chain look like, it might be more interesting to have this tailored approach so that you really look into your sourcing categories and of course, where you source from. So this is another element that is very important, right? Where are you sourcing from and what kind of sourcing category you have. And this combination is where you really manage to define the first layer of risk. Of course, after that, you can apply self-assessment questionnaires where you get to understand in a desktop-based approach the level of management capacity of your suppliers. It also brings another level for this risk understanding of the supply chain, and you might also go for audits on the field where you really get to understand more and more. So the risk approach for supply chains, it starts with this overall assessment in the beginning so that you can define a system of consequences on how to handle and go deeper. But of course, you need to then, as a funnel, you need to decide, okay, where I'm going to engage more suppliers so that I can get closer to the real risk. So what's really happening on the ground and even sometimes close to the impact. I don't know if Marcus, Cecilia, you have something to complement on that.
I would move on to the next question.
Okay.
There's a question by Alexandre Montelet, and he's asking, to what extent does the publication of the directive's draft mark at the end of efforts for national due diligence legislation and the end of efforts, or such as the end of efforts for a binding international treaty? That's two different political processes. From what I know so far is that a lot of governments, parliaments, and so on said, well, we'll wait for the European legislation. There's different stages. The Spanish government originally said we're going to wait for the European legislation. Now they put it back on the agenda to maybe create a Spanish law. There's a debate going on in Belgium. The Luxembourgish government is also looking into whether they should have a national law or not, but also are referring to EU developments. Same thing goes for the Netherlands, where there's an initiative to have a wider scope, to widen the scope of due diligence legislation existing in the Netherlands, but also there's a movement saying, well, let's wait for EU legislation there. So there's not a one answer for all. What's clear is that the German government clearly committed to saying, once the EU directive is in place, we're going to adapt the Lieferkettengesetz to the European law. That's clear. That's also part of the law. The second thing on the UN binding international treaty, which looks at other topics, and that is a different political process going on at the UN or Human Rights Council in Geneva. I would not say that it is affected, whether it stops or not, is not directly related to the political process on the EU due diligence law. It's a separate process and it will be looked at separately. So there are few more questions.
Yes, maybe I can answer one on the benefits of the law. This is also a question in general. And I think one of the benefits that I see, and when we talked about, I think Marcus mentioned that also, we know that there are several countries that have already enacted, of course, in Germany, for instance, that's an example, on due diligence obligations on the national level, also with France. And the directive will probably prevent legal fragmentation, because when we have different legislations at the national level with different requirements, sometimes with differences in the scope, as we have already observed, this might cause legal uncertainty. And I think this is one of the things that the directive is trying to tackle by the EU Commission is trying to tackle by proposing this draft. And I think this is one of the the benefits in this regard. And in terms, of course, of citizens and I think investors, this will provide more transparency because there's, of course, they will, the companies will need to report on that. And I think this will provide transparency in the way companies are tackling human rights challenges, how they are preventing adverse impacts, and how they are addressing those risks. And I think this is also a beneficial point that I would make in terms of what this directive will bring. Yeah, I think this is what I wanted to make. I don't know, Marcus, if you would like to add on that.
Yeah, I would just add the remark I made at the beginning, is that for countries, for European countries, EU countries, the biggest trading bloc in the world at the moment, of course, there's an inherent interest that trade relations are rule-based, and that these trade relations are organized in a way that nobody feels they're being disadvantaged. And at the moment, we have a lot of rules in international trade which protect investors, for example, which protect trade, but there is a gap of with rules that protect people that are or might be affected by human rights abuse. So there's a gap in international trade regulation, if you want to call it that way. And I hope that these due diligence laws will help improve that situation, which is, I believe, in the interest of keeping the world an open place where people are protected but can interact with each other. I see two other questions which I find quite interesting. Claire was asking a question whether we can, given specific, say what we believe, how this will specifically affect financial sector. Any thoughts about that?
I think in terms of the scope, this has been also by criticism, subject to criticism, because the scope is a bit is narrowed in terms of the due diligence obligation. So I think this is something that we'll see whether it will be extended, because the directive claims to be based on talking about industry that are high impact industry in terms of the risk following the OECD guidelines, and the OECD guidelines has the OECD has a specific guidelines on the financial sector, but still the directive has narrowed down the due diligence obligations of the financial sector. So this only before providing the service in terms of, for instance, of the identification of risk. So I think we will see whether this will stay or it will be broadened in terms of the duties for the financial sector. And I think, yeah, this is one of the points that has been highly debated because we all know how the influence and the role and the leverage the financial industry has in this regard when it comes to the respect of human rights and fostering a change in that. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can just make a comment on that, because this is a very good example. When I talk about human rights due diligence and robust human rights due diligence, right? So as Cecilia mentioned, so the first draft of the directive has put this limitation in the financial sector, saying that the screening, the human rights due diligence takes place before providing services. But of course, violations can take place after. So if you think of robust human rights due diligence, you're not going to limit yourself. And this is our advice to clients. So this is just to illustrate a bit this point.
Well, there's another question to you, Raquel, here, I would say, from Rüdiger. He's asking whether we could elaborate about the options a company has to engage with suppliers. Do we have any best practice that we could share?
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned, you have always to start with a risk-based approach, right? So it's very important. I mean, it's very rare that companies, unless you have very defined, small supply chain, not a lot of suppliers that you can then engage with all of them. But of course, in general, you have a lot of suppliers. You really need to prioritize. So this is really the first step. And once you prioritize, then you have to find the best way to engage with them. Of course, you can engage in a desktop-based approach in terms of collecting information, trying to understand their management capacity. You can go to audits on the ground, but of course, you can also provide trainings. And this is a point that the directive addresses when it comes to SMEs, right? That then the companies should support SMEs in conducting this due diligence process. So you can have this approach of conducting audits and checks, which is okay, not, it's a good point to start, but again, you might also need to provide support. And this is really important that you really prioritize and understand your suppliers' needs so that you can also support them in implementing the diligence process. On top of that, you also have a lot of tools like that try to understand what's happening on the ground, like Workers' Voice tool, where you can collect information directly. And you can, of course, join industry initiatives where, the industry initiatives might be establishing grievance mechanisms for certain sectors, providing trainings. So I think these are a few examples on how you can engage.
Great, thank you. So our director is telling us we have 3 minutes left. So one more question, I would say we can answer one more question, or maybe take two. So there's a question by Jan and also by Jochen, which are looking at the scope of the law, whether a certain company would fall within the scope, and they're both giving examples of, I guess, their own companies or companies they are close to. Do you want to say something about that, Cecilia?
Yeah, I don't see the question. So what?
They're in the Q&A box. Can you see them? I can read them. So a question by Jan is, to what extent is a company affected by, in this draft, that has around 300 employees in Germany and then possibly falls below the threshold, but has thousands of employees worldwide?
Yeah, I think we will need to go into the details on that. It's hard now to, I don't dare to give a straightforward answer on that in terms of the scope. And also, of course, these are probably good questions to ask within the legal departments of the companies, just to make sure that you clarify the scope and to understand whether you fall within the scope or not by taking into account the legal entity, the structure of the businesses. So I will leave that as an indications and maybe guidance for that. Yeah.
There's another question by Jochen, which also is asking about the scope of a different kind of case. So maybe I would give an answer from a business perspective. There's always the legal perspective, which you should ask your lawyer, your legal department. And if they, especially legal departments, sometimes find it hard to understand human rights due diligence legislation, of course, we're always happy to have a debate around these things and explain our point of view. But you should always also, next to the legal perspective, take the business perspective into account. What does it mean for your business? What kind of business do you have? It's not a question whether legally you are within the scope or not. It is a question, are you part of a supply chain which is highly exposed to risks, for example? Are you under pressure from investors, from your bank, or from your corporate clients? Do they want to know the risks that you have? So these are also questions that you need to ask yourself. Or do your employees have questions to the management about the risks and the way that the management is actually dealing with these risks? So it's important to look at the law and to take the legal perspective, but I find it at least as important to also take a look from the other perspectives, which are some of them reputational, some of them are financial or have other business aspect. And most importantly, I believe for a responsible business, for a business that wants to be there in 5 and 10 years from now, it's really important to know, just for yourself, to know what kind of risks do I actually have in my supply chain. Whether you are a 50-person or a 500 or a 5,000 person business, you should know, do I have a risk? Am I risk exposed? Is this something I should do? Is this something I can do? And that's what I would call responsible business conduct. Ask yourself this question, even if from a legal point of view, you might not be in the scope of this law. That was it from our side. Anything you would like to add, Cecilia, Raquel?
I think you summarized it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the key messages.
The key messages are there. They're going beyond legal aspects and also taking into account the business perspective. I think that's a key message and an important one, definitely. Yeah, thanks. Okay,
well, thanks a lot to both of you for joining me today and for giving your input. And thanks a lot, of course, to Sarah, who's our director in the background, who went with us through the script and who helped us set this up and spread the message about this webinar. And most of all, thank you to everyone that participated. Please feel free to get in touch if you have more questions, something crosses your mind tomorrow, send us an email. It's very easy. It's just our first name @löning.org. So easy to remember emails. Please get in touch if you have more questions, and wishing you a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thank you
and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.